Okay, everybody, hi. Right now, I want you to know that we're taping this class to be broadcast on one of these Tuesdays when I'm not here. Actually, on this particular Tuesday, I'm in upstate New York. I'm speaking at a conference for pastors and leaders, and since it's about 5 o'clock your time, I guess that's when this is going to be shown, I'm probably just wrapping up my message, or maybe in the middle of the message I'm preaching to this particular conference. So if you think to, you can say a prayer for me while I'm back there teaching at this conference for pastors and leaders. So what we're covering today in our survey between Joshua and Esther is today our focus is on the book of Ruth. It's obviously the third book in the series. We've talked about Joshua, we've talked about Judges. Now, today in this particular class, we're going to talk about Ruth. And Ruth actually, of course, is a very short book. You can see that in your Bible. It just takes a couple of pages. It's just 4 chapters long. And so this is going to be one of the shorter books of the Bible that we take a look at. And though we're not going to hurry our way through it, it'll probably just won't take us as long a time to get through this particular book just because it is so short. So this is what we're dealing with, some key facts or statistics about the book of Ruth. Number one, it takes only 4 chapters. It has only 85 verses, less than 100 verses. And what you need to know about the book of Ruth is that it takes place during the book of Judges. Not at the end necessarily of the book of Judges, not at the beginning, but kind of somewhere in the middle of the book of Judges. And we call this book the book of Ruth because she is the principal figure of the book. Now, the author of the book of Ruth is unknown. There are many people who suppose that it was the prophet Samuel. As we discussed last week, Samuel is the one normally thought to be the one who authored the book of Judges, but we don't know that for sure. We're not given that. But let's say he was the likely author. For the book of Ruth, maybe we're talking a little bit more speculative. If Samuel was the author, we don't exactly know. And if you're talking about a time period, for how much time from Ruth chapter 1, the beginning, to Ruth chapter 4, the end, you're talking about a time period of perhaps about 12 years. 10 to 12, something along in that range. So that's some of our sort of basic facts about the book of Ruth. Let me sort of read to you the idea from a summary given in the Open Bible. I've told you that how much I like the notes that are found in the Open Bible and some of the things told to us there. So I thought, let's go through some of this. And this is a great summary statement in the introduction that's given in the Open Bible. It says this: Ruth is a cameo story of love, devotion, and redemption set in the grim context of the days of the Judges. It is a story of a Moabite woman who forsakes her pagan heritage in order to cling to the people of Israel and the God of Israel. So let's just kind of take that apart piece by piece. First of all, we're talking about this. It's a cameo story of love, devotion, and redemption. Friends, that's just about every Hollywood movie or Lifetime series or Hallmark movie channel thing you've ever seen. This is just a great love story. It's the romance of redemption. That's how some people talk about the book of Ruth. Another thing you got to consider about the book of Ruth is it's just so beautifully done. I'll never forget when I was taking a standard English literature class. I think it was a standard English 101 class, and I was taking it at Ventura College. And there I am in my young 20s taking the class. And I'll never forget when the literary professor, the English professor, stood up and he was going to talk about the book of Ruth, and he said that the book of Ruth is the best short story in human existence. And he's not just talking about in terms of biblical truth. The guy wasn't a believer as far as I know. But what he was he was just simply a man who knew how to appreciate a well-told, meaningful story. And look, that is the book of Ruth. It's a short story, but filled with meaning. So again, let's just kind of walk ourselves through this definition. It's a cameo story of love, devotion, and redemption set in the grim context of the days of the Judges. That's something that we really need to remember as we take our tour through the book of Ruth. It is set in the grim days of the Judges because there is a beauty existing in the book of Ruth that is not characteristic of the time of the Judges as a whole. And it's kind of interesting to see, and this is one of the points of the book of Ruth, to show us that not everything was wicked and terrible in the days of the Judges. There was a lot of wickedness and terrible conduct, but not everything was like that. And then next in our definition we see that it speaks about it's a story of a Moabite woman who forsakes her pagan heritage in order to cling to the people of Israel and the God of Israel. And again, this is something that's essential to the story of Ruth. Ruth, the main character after whom we name this book of the Bible, she's not an Israelite, at least not by birth. By birth, she is not a daughter of Israel. By earth, she was a Moabitess from a neighboring nation. And this is a very important aspect to the context of the book of Ruth. So let's kind of go on while considering it. How would we say that the book of Ruth advances God's plan of redemption throughout the book? Well, first of all, we would say that it shows that God was working even in the dark days of the judges. And I just mentioned that, but again, I just want to emphasize this. It's an essential fact to show that God did not abandon Israel in these days. Actually, he was moving. Now, where the biggest trouble was in the days of the judges was sort of on the national level. But when you came down to individual families, there were many families that still honored God, many communities that still looked to him. And this is that enduring testimony we see reflected through the book of Judges. Secondly, we would say that the book of Ruth shows God's advancing plan of redemption in the way that it shows God's care to preserve and further the line of the Messiah. A couple weeks ago, we were going through the book of Joshua, and we noticed that in the genealogy of Jesus, a notable figure in the book of Joshua appears, and that's Rahab, the Canaanite harlot, the Canaanite prostitute, Rahab. She trusts in Yahweh, is received into Israel, and becomes part of the Messianic line. Oh, very similar things happens with Ruth. She's not an Israelite. She's a Moabitess. Now, Ruth doesn't come from the same infamous background as far as prostitution and the rest of it that Rahab did, but Ruth has her own difficulties growing up in a pagan culture. Well, we see her as sort of this outsider who's brought into the family of Israel and then exalted so high that she ends up to be in the genealogy of Jesus and, of course, in the genealogy of King David as well. Okay, continuing on, we see that the book of Ruth also shows the principle of the kinsman redeemer. This is the principle of something called the goel in Hebrew, and we're going to get back to that, but just keep that in mind. The principle of the kinsman redeemer has a connection with God's plan of redemption as it's related throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament together. So I think those are three major ways. Maybe you guys can think of some other ways. You can have discussion amongst yourself. But by the way, we're showing this by way of video. If you guys find it helpful to pause the video and have a little bit of discussion, go right ahead. I mean, that's perfectly fine to do. But what I'm just saying, those are three ways that I could think of, at least immediately, that the story of Ruth advances God's plan of redemption. Now, it's sort of a different question how the book of Ruth shows us Jesus. We'll talk about that later. But let's talk about, first of all, this woman Ruth, the name Ruth. The name Ruth may be, we don't know exactly where it comes from, but maybe the best clue, and again, we can't say this with real certitude, but the name Ruth may be a Moabite modification of the Hebrew word reut, meaning friendship or association. Now, if that is true, it's really a wonderful name. Because one of the outstanding qualities, one of the outstanding characteristics of this woman Ruth was the great friendship that she showed to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And so we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And so that may very well be where the name Ruth comes from. Continuing on, if we just kind of want to do a survey of the life of Ruth, she is the main character of the book, we'd see first of all that this woman Ruth was born in Moab, that is, she was a Moabitess. We'll talk about Moab and where they came from and how they were related to Israel in just a few moments. So she was born in Moab, Moabitess. For now, it's just enough to emphasize the idea that she was not an Israelite. She was not of the 12 tribes of Israel. She was not a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Matter of fact, you would say that she was not a descendant of Abraham at all. Okay, and anyway, born in Moab, a Moabitess. Secondly, she married an Israelite man, the son of Elimelech. Now, Elimelech had two sons. I believe one's name was Chilion, and the other one, the one that Ruth married, his name was Mahlon. So an Israelite family moved from Israel, specifically from the city of Bethlehem, and they moved to Moab, and we'll discuss the circumstances under which they moved pretty soon. But the bottom line is simply this, is that Ruth married the son of this Israelite man. His name was Elimelech. Now, she came back to Israel, to the town of Bethlehem, with her mother-in-law Naomi. In other words, while they are in Moab, the family, the father Elimelech dies. His 2 sons die. His 2 sons had married Moabite women, and so the name of one was Orpah, the name of the other one was Ruth, and one of them, Ruth, namely, went back with her mother-in-law Naomi to Israel in the village of Bethlehem. The other one stayed back in Moab. When they came to Bethlehem, the first thing that we see is that Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi have to struggle to live and survive in the midst of poverty. They came from Moab to Bethlehem penniless, and they had lost whatever holdings their family had in Bethlehem before they left. So they struggled to live in poverty, but then finally, and then this is where the great romantic, beautiful thing comes in the story, Ruth, and by extension her mother-in-law Naomi, but Ruth was rescued from her poverty, rescued from her very poor prospects, because she was redeemed by and married to the very influential man Boaz. You know, it's one of these rags to riches, sort of Cinderella story. Ruth is very much like this Cinderella kind of character, a woman of good character, of godliness, as we're going to see in the text. But also she was a woman who was really down and out, yet this heroic man, and I think it's entirely fair to describe Boaz as a heroic man, this heroic man comes and rescues her from her circumstances. So that's sort of an outline of the life of Ruth. When we take a look at how the book of Ruth sits in relation to the Old Testament books, you see that it is not one of the books of the law, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. It is not one of the poetic books of the Old Testament. It is not one of the prophetic books of the Old Testament. Instead, it stands in that second column that we see on the chart, the books that are known as the historical books, the books that we're studying in the midst of this class. And you see that Ruth has its place as being the third of the historical books of the Bible, at least in the way that we arrange it in the Christian Bible. If you want to take a look at how it all lays out in the span of Old Testament history, if you look at the chart that we have up on the screen right now, you'll see that thin sliver of a red line represents the time span of the book of Ruth. Now, actually, you would, if you're really making the chart accurately, you'd make that sliver even thinner than it was, but you get the idea. It's this thin set line in the midst of the time of the 350 or so years that made up the period of the Judges. So Ruth takes place sort of in the middle of the period of the Judges. I didn't really take the time to do the calculations out well enough to figure out exactly where, but just somewhere in the middle of the book of Judges, that's where the book of Ruth takes place. So again, we notice that we're still fairly much at the beginning of our whole section of the historical survey, but we are in the midst of this one very large section that takes up the book of Judges itself. So we go on to our next slide, and we just sort of take a look at these charts that I lifted from the Open Bible. Again, I just really am impressed with these sort of organizational charts that the Open Bible uses and the way that they discuss those things. So I just sort of lifted these charts. And by the way, I've put these charts on the class website, for the Generation Bible College website. You can access and get these charts in just it'd be a sort of a picture file, a JPEG file. You can download it and take a look at it for yourself. The charts that are on the website, none of them are highlighted. I highlight the section in yellow that I want to take a look at just for the sake of this. And so what we're talking about first here is the topic of the book of Ruth. And the first thing that we see is the focus. And the focus of the book of Ruth can be divided into 2 parts. First of all, you have Ruth's love demonstrated, and then Ruth's love rewarded. Now, the demonstration of Ruth's love is first primarily towards, well, you could say it's towards her husband, because she married this Israelite man who came to Moab, but it's also demonstrated in her devotion to Naomi. Ruth demonstrated a lot of love, not only in being willing to follow Naomi from Moab to Israel, but also in the way that she very actively and energetically took care of Naomi when they came to the city of Bethlehem, or the village, actually, you would say. But then the second aspect of it is, you see there on the right-hand column, Ruth's love rewarded. Her love was rewarded because she came and entered into this beautiful, this lovely relationship with Boaz, this wealthy, influential, very godly man. And so, it's a great love story in that respect. So you see the first 3 chapters are pretty much made up with this theme of Ruth's love's demonstrated, and then the last chapter is the reward of Ruth's love. Then you see on the next division that we want to take a look at, the topic. Well, the topic, again, through the first 3 chapters, and again, if you go to the reference aisle right there, you can see the reference row, I should say, you can see where the chapter divisions lay out. Through the first 3 chapters, you can see that it deals primarily with Ruth and Naomi, but in the last chapter, it deals with Ruth and Boaz. So that's the subject, the 2 main relationships going on, Ruth and Naomi, then Ruth and Boaz. But then on the row below that, you can see that it deals with, first of all, the death of the family there, relevant to Ruth and Naomi, and then Ruth's care for Naomi. So this is what it dealt with in the first 3 chapters. And then finally, you have in Ruth chapter 4, Boaz's care for Ruth, and then finally the birth of their family, how they come together in this family relationship. Next, we come up here and we see under the column of the divisions of the book, the first thing that happens in chapter 1, essentially, is that Ruth decides to stay with Naomi. That's kind of the critical change that happens in chapter 1. Then in chapter 2, you see Ruth's devotion to care for Naomi. Again, this is her mother-in-law. Then you have, going on to chapter 3, Ruth's request for redemption by Boaz. She makes the request in chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, you have Ruth's reward of redemption by Boaz. And again, I just like this chart from the Open Bible. I think it's laid out very well and helps you to understand the structure of the work. We have different locations. Now, I told you when we started our class that if you take this historical book all the way, this historical collection of books in the Old Testament, all the way from the book of Joshua to the book of Esther, which we're going to be covering week by week as we make our way through the class, the location of the action in these books is almost exclusively in Israel. Well, here's where we go back to the place almost, because it is not exclusively in Israel, it's almost exclusively. I see right there we just had a photograph taken here while I'm doing this class. It's all right. Well, it's all right. It just made a little flash there. Is it a good picture? How's the picture looking right there?
That looks good.
All right. Well, if Michael is there, he's going to be there at the class. If he wants to show you the picture, then we can do that. In any regard, I want you to notice that this is one of the rare exceptions in this whole section of the 250 or more chapters of these historical books that begin at Joshua and end at Esther, where the action takes place someplace else other than Israel. You see there in the first chapter, the action takes place primarily in Moab, where Ruth was from. But then into chapter 2, we're transported to the fields of Bethlehem. Into chapter 3, we have the threshing floor of Bethlehem, where Boaz was doing his work. And then finally, you have sort of the town square, the gates of Bethlehem, into chapter 4. And then next, we see the book of Ruth encompasses about 12 years. Look, we say about because we can't say exactly. It could have been a little bit more, it could have been a little bit less. But what we're looking at from beginning to end of the book of Ruth is something like 10 or 12 years. So that's sort of our chart, our breakdown of the book of Ruth from beginning to end. Let's talk about some of the keys to the book of Ruth. As I mentioned before, but again, it's a short book. It's good for us to mention again. The book of Ruth begins with Ruth being widowed in Moab. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that that's what it begins with. What it begins with in chapter 1 is the family of Elimelech and Naomi, his wife, moving from Bethlehem. These were Israelites of the tribe of Judah, of the village of Bethlehem. They moved from Bethlehem and they went to Moab. And you say, well, why would they do such a thing? This wasn't their land. God had given them the land of Bethlehem. They had an inheritance in Bethlehem. Well, notice this. Verse 1 of Ruth chapter 1 says this. Let me read it to you. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Well, that man was the man Elimelech. So here you have this broad sphere of 350 or 400 years, the days of the judges. And in these days when the judges ruled, there was a famine. That doesn't surprise us. It's a long period of time. You're not going to go through a span of 350 years without having a famine in some of those years. But during that time, notice what happens. A certain man of Bethlehem, he went to go live in the country of Moab. Why? He did it because of the famine. Now, one thing you should know about Bethlehem was that it was known for being a rich agricultural area. Matter of fact, the name Bethlehem means house of bread. And so if with that name, house of bread, doesn't surprise us that, okay, it's a place where they did a lot of agriculture back then, but it was affected by the famine. And out of fear of the famine, he left Bethlehem and he went across the wilderness, across the Dead Sea. I don't think he actually went across it in a boat, but he went around it. Over on the other side of the Dead Sea into the land of Moab. We're going to bust out a map a little bit just to give you an idea where it is more exactly. But anyway, one thing you need to understand is, at least conceptually, Elimelech and his family were going backwards. When Israel came up out of Egypt, they went through the land of Moab to go into Canaan. It's almost as if he's retracing the exact steps in reverse and leaving the promised land and going into Moab. Now, one of the things you find out as you read the Old Testament, and especially these historical books of the Old Testament, that God put such a high value on the land and on Israel dwelling in the land that it is almost always a bad thing when Israel leaves the land. If they leave the land, bad thing. And that's what's happening here with Elimelech. So anyway, it begins with Ruth being widowed in Moab. Secondly, it ends with Ruth being married in Bethlehem. So, I mean, look, to go from widowhood to marriage again, especially in the ancient world, when it might be quite unlikely that a widow would ever be married again, it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. That's just a great love story that we see there. So at the beginning, Ruth is widowed. At the end, she's married once again, and married to quite a guy, to a wonderful guy, Boaz. And then the key word, I would say, throughout the book of Ruth is this idea. And I don't know if I should say it's a key word. Maybe I should have wrote instead of key word, key concept. But the key concept in the book of Ruth is this idea of the kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in some depth. If you were to talk about key verses in the book of Ruth, I would say chapter 1, verse 16 and 3:11, which we'll take a look at in just a moment. A key chapter, Ruth 4, it kind of brings all the strands. It's the happily ever after. Come on, that's what makes a story good. If you don't have the happily ever after, you know, it's just not such a great story. So anyway, let's take a look at these key verses. Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. Now, please understand, this is Ruth speaking to Naomi, her mother-in-law. And this is what she says. But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you." In other words, don't beg me to leave you. "Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." Now, this is a beautiful and poetic statement of Ruth towards her mother-in-law. And you kind of need to get the context of this great statement. After the sore disappointment of Naomi in going to Moab, because initially they left Bethlehem because of fear of the famine, they moved to Moab, and the news was pretty good. Their sons found good wives there. They married a gal named Ruth. They married a gal named Orpah. The 2 sons, Mahalan and Chilion, okay, great. They're there. But then Elimelech dies, the father. So now Naomi's a widow. Well, look, it happens, but at least she has her sons. Then her sons both died. So now she's a widow without any children of her own, yet she does have her daughter-in-laws. So at the death of her 2 sons, by the way, we're not told anything about how the sons died, but at the death of her 2 sons, they leave Moab, or excuse me, not they, Specifically, Naomi leaves Moab to go back to Bethlehem, and her two daughter-in-laws come with her. And you have this vision of them kind of making their way out of the city when Naomi tells the both of them, don't come. Life is probably going to be a lot harder for you as a foreigner living in Bethlehem than it would be if you simply returned back to your own land. Well, Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, she said, okay, I'm going back. Ruth says, no, I'm coming with you. And what was the great reason why she did? Well, there were many reasons, just nobility, a devotion to her mother-in-law, but because she also believed in the God of Israel. That's why you have this great statement. Let me read it again, verse 116. This is what Ruth says in this context to her mother-in-law Naomi. Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. I know, have you guys ever seen that verse quoted at a wedding? It's kind of a common verse, and sometimes it's used to express the devotion of a couple one to another, or sometimes more specifically, the devotion of a wife unto her husband, to say, wherever you go, I'll go, wherever you lodge, I'll lodge, your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And that's a wonderful thing, but just what I want you to notice is, this was not originally spoken between a marital couple, but between a daughter-in-law and her mother-in-law. And it's really a remarkable statement. Now notice this. In this statement is the recognition for Ruth that previous to her time, or at least in her upbringing, her God was not the God of Israel. She was raised with the gods of the Moabites, and we'll speak about in just a moment. So that's one key verse, Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. But I think we can go to another key verse, Ruth chapter 3, verse 11. This is what Boaz says to Ruth later on. Okay, so the first statement is from Ruth to Naomi. This is a statement by Boaz unto Ruth, where he says this, and now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. Think of that phrase, virtuous woman. We'll come back to that in just a little bit, but it is sort of a key phrase in the book of Ruth. And this, of course, is Boaz praising the character of Ruth, and it's a great aspect of the story. Okay, continuing on, we're taking a look now just a little bit at the geography. We see this map of the tribes of Israel. I don't exactly have my laser pointer with me. Maybe somebody there can work the laser pointer to indicate where Judah is and where the town of Bethlehem is, because you see the town of Bethlehem there at the northern extremity of the tribe of Judah, which is represented on the map in purple. You see to the east of Judah's territory the Dead Sea, and on the other side of the Dead Sea, the peoples of Moab. The Moabites lived on the other side of the Dead Sea from Judah, in the land that is today Jordan. Matter of fact, you can visit Jordan and go up on the heights of Moab, and you can see where the Moabites lived, and on and on. So the thing to be clear is that it was somewhat of a journey for them to take to go from Bethlehem to the land of Moab, but they did this. We get a little better picture here. This one is enlarged. There you can see a little bit better way. Again, the town of Bethlehem up at the northern area of Judah, and then Moab there across the second side of, across, I should say, the Dead Sea and its own thing. Underneath where the tribe of Reuben would have been on the east side of the Jordan River. So that's really our geography. The whole story takes place in that area, either in Moab or in the village there of Bethlehem. Continuing on, if we talk about Moab and what it was as a location, who were the Moabites? Where did they come from? Well, the Moabites descended from Lot and his daughters. Look, let's be honest, it's kind of a sordid story in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 19, beginning at verse 30, describes how after the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot and his family lived in the city of Sodom. After the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his wife and his two daughters escaped. However, the wife was killed along the way because she looked back when the angel of God had specifically told her, do not look back. She looked back, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his 2 daughters went on, and they dwelt in a cave. Matter of fact, if you go out to the Judean desert today, they'll show you the cave. They'll point to a thing, who knows? But, guides love to do this. This was the pillar of salt. This was the cave where they hid. Again, who knows? This is what I want you to understand, is that for Lot and his daughters, they felt that it was the end of the world. Their cities, which was all the world that they pretty much knew of, had been destroyed by some kind of awesome fire and brimstone coming down from heaven. It was like a nuclear bomb had come down upon their cities, and they alone seemingly escaped. You could forgive them for thinking that maybe the world ended, and they're thinking about this whole kind of desert island scenario. What do we do to repopulate the world? And they look at themselves, women of childbearing age. They look at their father. Who was their father? I mean, to lay with their father in a sexual sense would have been incest and just completely wrong. Yet nevertheless, probably out of the idea that they were, that it was the end of the world, they had sex with their father, and one of the children born from that union was Moab, who became the father of the Moabites. Now, the Moabites worshiped the god Chemosh, or Chemosh. You find this in Numbers chapter 21, Judges chapter 11, and 1 Kings chapter 11. They worshiped this pagan god. He was the deity of the Moabites. So they did not worship Yahweh. Even though distantly they were connected to the people of Israel. They were like distant cousins to the people of Israel because, of course, Lot was not a descendant of Abraham, but he was Abraham's nephew. He was related to Abraham. And so if you go back far enough, you find this cousin-like connection between the people of Moab and the people of Israel. Nevertheless, they did not receive the God of Israel, Yahweh. They had their own god, Chemosh, who was an idol. Israel fought wars with Moab. They fought wars about 200 years before the time of Ruth, at the beginning period of the book of Judges. And then they fought Moab again about 100 years after the time of Ruth, in the days of Saul, king of Israel. So the relationship between Israel and Moab was often good. They sort of had a friendly relationship between the two, but not always. There were times when they went to war, and it was more than just these 2 occasions, but those are sort of the 2 notable occasions close to the time of Ruth. Going on, if we want to take a look at the characters that we encounter throughout the book of Ruth, these are the ones that we see. First of all, we see the notable names. Well, first of all, you have the name Bethlehem. That's where the whole story begins. Remember, Bethlehem means house of bread. And maybe I should just elaborate on that for a moment. To me, one of the fascinating things and one of the most instructive lessons that we gain from the book of Ruth is to see how Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 kids, they left Bethlehem because they believed that they would starve to death. There was a famine in the land. We got to survive. Now, look, you can't blame people for moving from one place to another if you think you're going to die. I mean, if you think it's that bad, okay, you could see there'd be a motivation to die, or motivation to escape death, of course. Now, this is what I find absolutely fascinating. Some 10 years later, when they come back to the land of Bethlehem, and Elimelech is dead in Moab, and the 2 sons are dead in Moab, and it's just Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth that come back. When they come back to Bethlehem, what's there? Is this whole city dead from a famine 10 years ago? Is it a ghost town because everybody died from the famine? No. God took care of them just fine. It shows the absurdity in the very beginning of it. Elimelech never needed to leave Bethlehem. If he would have trusted God and just stayed there, he would have been provided for just like everybody else was provided for. But of course, this is a difficult thing, isn't it? Sometimes we get nervous, sometimes we lack in our faith to God, and this is what happened with Elimelech and his family. Even though he said, and you can see the meaning of his name in the slide up there, the meaning of his name is, "My God is King." He certainly didn't seem to live as if his God was king. No, a God did not seem to be greater than the famine in Elimelech's mind. Even though God took care of everybody else, they went to Moab and they suffered because of it. All right, next character in the book is you have Elimelech. Excuse me, we have Elimelech's wife, whose name was Naomi. Now, Naomi is a great name. It means pleasant. Isn't that a great? Who doesn't like pleasant? You take a look at this. What a beautiful couple. You have Elimelech, my God is king, which speaks of great trust and submission to God. And then on the other hand, you have this other person named Naomi, pleasant. I mean, it just seems like, yes, just from the meaning of their names, you think this is a very happy, godly couple. But then you have their two names, the names of their two sons. And this is fascinating. The two sons were named Mahalan and Chilion. Mahalan means sick. Now, that's not such a great name to name your son, to name him sick. Now, maybe there's a reason. Maybe he was sick in his youth very much. I mean, maybe that was the whole reason. But they named him sick, and Chilion means pining. Do you know what pining means? Pining means to waste away. That's another way of describing wasting away. So one child was named sick, the other child was named wasting away, and then you come over to the meanings of the daughter-in-laws. Ruth's name means friendship, which is remarkable. She very much shows that she was a great friend. But it also sees that the other daughter-in-law, her name was Orpah. And please notice that's Orpah. That's not our resident over here in Montecito, Oprah. This is Orpah. Orpah means stubbornness. Now, what's fascinating about this is when Naomi returns with Ruth to the town of Bethlehem, it's really remarkable. Notice this. Let me just read you from the text. Ruth chapter 1, starting at verse 19. It says, "Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem, and it happened when they had come to Bethlehem that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, 'Is this Naomi?'" Now, what's fascinating is, she had only left 10 or 12 years before. But apparently, she had aged so much in those years that they're saying, "Is this the same woman?" And it wasn't just the years, it was the trouble. Her husband had died, her sons had died. She realized that they had been very foolish for moving to Moab. One of her daughter-in-laws had abandoned her. Anyway, all the women said, "Is this Naomi?" Now, verse 20 of chapter 1. "But she said to them, 'Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me.'" What a name change, isn't it? Because the name, as you see in the slide on the screen, Naomi means pleasant, Mara means bitter. And what a change. What a change for a woman to go from pleasant to bitter. But that's exactly the experience of life that Naomi endured. Finally, let's just take a quick look at the meaning of the name Boaz. That's a great name. It means in him is strength. He's a strong man. He's the one who has strength. And we're going to see the whole story play out with these characters. So again, when you take a look at the leading characters of the book of Ruth, as we saw in the chart, the first pairing is Ruth and Naomi. The second pairing is Ruth and Boaz. So you have these three main characters, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. So Naomi, we already know a little bit about her. She went from pleasant to bitter. But you know what's great? By the end of the story, she goes back to pleasant. Matter of fact, she's wonderfully blessed. She's blessed in an amazing way. God doesn't leave her in that bitter place. But notice next, after that, you have Naomi, then you have Ruth. Now, Ruth is called something very interesting in Ruth chapter 3, verse 1. She's called a virtuous woman, and I don't really know if I know how to pronounce this correctly according to him, a kael. Now, this kael is a term that's applied to a woman of particular virtue. Matter of fact, in Proverbs chapter 31, that famous, who can find a virtuous woman in the whole description, it's using that description of the virtuous woman. So the virtuous woman is a theme that goes throughout the Old Testament. And that's exactly what Boaz calls Ruth. We read the verse earlier. Let me just read it to you again. Ruth chapter 3, verse 11. "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. It's really a wonderful thing for Boaz to say. Not only that he considers her to be a virtuous woman, but he noted that everybody else knew that she was a virtuous woman. And really, that is a high compliment for a man to give to a woman. So here you have Ruth, this virtuous woman. Now, that has the idea of it being applied to a woman. Boaz is also given this Hebrew name, I suppose in the masculine form, but the Hebrew one, Akael. Now notice this. This is found in Ruth chapter 2, verse 1, where it says, there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. In the ancient Hebrew, that phrase, a man of great wealth, translates the idea of the Chayil. Now, you know what else is fascinating about this? I'm trusting that some of you have the familiarity with the Bible to understand this, that in the books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you have this group of men that are known as David's mighty men, or a mighty man of valor. Sometimes that expression. That is the same Hebrew word, chayil. It refers to a man of strength, a man of honor. There are some commentators, and these would be like older European commentators, that have the idea that really, as it's expressed towards a man, would be a knight. You know, someone who was noble, someone who was strong. You wouldn't want to mess with a knight. You wouldn't want to mess with a knight, but yet there was a chivalry, there was a nobility, there was a strength to the man. That's kind of all embodied. What I just find fascinating about this is that essentially the same term is applied to a man of excellence and a woman of excellence. Now, it works out a little bit different, but it is almost as if it's taken from the medieval conception of the knight and the lady. You know, here's the lady, a woman of strength and virtue and reverence before God and all the rest of it that implies. That's Ruth. She's the chayil. But then Boaz is also a chayil, but he's like the knight in the sense that he's strong, he's brave, he's a man of honor. There's a lot tied up in those words. So you see it reflected in these three characters, Naomi to Mara, then Ruth to Boaz. It just seems to be a remarkable combination there. Now, let's kind of just walk through the important events of the book. First of all, we have Elimelech's family moving to Moab. I think we talked about that enough. The reasons for their move, they moved because of the famine, the perceived need. Even though they found out that everybody seemed to survive just fine, even though the family moved away out of this perceived necessity. Then also in chapter 1, Elimelech and his sons die in Moab, a very tragic thing. I mean, of course, it's tragic, but this is part of the world, both ancient and modern. People tragically die. And poor Naomi especially, because she has to see the death of her husband and then the death of her two sons. And then also in chapter 1, we have Naomi and Ruth returning to Bethlehem. Now please notice, Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, she did not return, nor actually was she under any obligation to. If you were just to take it in chapter 1, you would say that Orpah was being the sensible one. It was much more sensible for her to say, my prospects are among my own people, I've got my best chances there, I'm going to stay in Moab. But you know what? Sometimes there is a sensibility in following God that goes far beyond anything that natural sense. So just sort of from a godless standpoint, Orpah was the sensible one, but from a spiritual standpoint, obviously Ruth was the sensible one. Now Ruth meets Boaz and works in his field. There's something here that I didn't really discuss or put down on the PowerPoint, but I think it's interesting to note out. Let me just read to you here. I'll begin at chapter 2, verse 1. There was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth of the family of Elimelech. His name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, please let me go to the field and glean heads of grain after him in whose sight I may find favor. And she said, go, my daughter. So she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come along the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Notice what it says that Ruth was doing in the field of Boaz. She was gleaning in the field. Now, what does that mean? Well, in this really beautiful way, God prescribed a way for the people of Israel who were quite poor and had no land and no way to provide for themselves. There was a way that they could gather food. God strictly instructed the farmers of Israel, when you go through and harvest your crops, don't take every piece of grain. Leave some behind. And if you drop a stalk of grain, don't go back and pick it up. Leave it. And then he said specifically as well, don't harvest the corners of your field. Leave those unharvested. Make a little circle at the corner of your field. Basically what God was telling them to do is, farmers, make sure you leave some behind. Well, why? Just for the birds to eat? No. So that the very poor could come in and glean from what was left behind. And friends, that's really wonderful, because what it did was it gave the poor a way to go in and to work for their own needs. Nobody was giving it to them. They had to go in there and gather it. They had to grind it into flour. Look, it wasn't like Boaz was throwing out bread for them to eat. No, he was just giving them or allowing them to gather the raw materials for their bread. And that's exactly what Ruth was doing, because she came back from Moab penniless. She had nothing, but she could work as a gleaner in the field. And then it's really kind of beautiful in chapter 2. In some ways, Ruth chapter 2 is the most beautiful chapter, because, it's kind of this initial meeting between Ruth and Boaz. And Boaz sees Ruth from a distance, and she catches his eye and says, "Who is that gal?" And says, "Oh, don't you know, this is a Ruth, and she came back with Naomi, and everybody thinks that she's a wonderful woman." And Boaz says, "Well, good, let me take a look out for you." And he goes and he greets Ruth, and he says, "Hey, let me make sure I keep an eye out for you." And then he tells some of his farmers, leave a little extra grain behind for Ruth. Leave out some handfuls on purpose just so you could pick it up. And so he's just finding ways to show small kindness. But he does it because of her hard work, her entrepreneurial spirit. When it's time for lunch, he says, come on over. Don't go over there with those rough guys. They might mistreat you. You come over and have lunch with my workers. And what he just does, he has a wonderful way of keeping an eye out for Ruth and taking care of her. He doesn't rush in and, so to speak, write her a big check, although he gives her some grain and such a little bit later on. But he just is very supportive of her. Well, then, into chapter 3, we have the plan for Ruth's redemption. And what happens there is, in chapter 3, Ruth approaches Boaz and indicates to him that she would like him to exercise the right of a kinsman redeemer over her. Now, what did that mean? Well, it meant a few things. It meant that the family of Elimelech, which Ruth was a representative of through her mother-in-law, Naomi, the family of Elimelech had claim to land in the area of Bethlehem. But that land had been forfeited. You could say that it was in bankruptcy court. But somebody with the right resources and the right family connections could buy out that land. But here's another complicating aspect to it, was that the land was also connected to the right of passing on descendants to the line of Elimelech. It worked like this. If you wanted Elimelech's land, you had to provide children for Elimelech's line, for his descendants. You had to marry Ruth. He had to marry Ruth. And this was a responsibility of someone called the kinsman redeemer. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Every family had its individuals or its group of individuals known as the kinsman redeemer. And they were the ones who were responsible for redeeming somebody when they were in bankruptcy, for passing on the line of a childless person if they were to die without descendants, and other things that we'll discuss in a few moments. In chapter 3, Ruth, under guidance from her mother-in-law, goes to Boaz. Now, some people think it's scandalous. She came to Boaz that night while he was sleeping on the threshing floor. And she uncovered the blanket that was at his feet and slept at his feet. There are people who and by the way, I'll just be sure, I think this is a gross distorting of the scriptures to say this. But there are people who think that something scandalous happened on the threshing floor, that there was some kind of sexual immorality or just whatever activity between Boaz and Ruth. The text doesn't give us a hint of that. Instead, what it shows is that Ruth took the position of a servant to Boaz, to sleep at his feet, to just be there and to sleep at his feet and to be ready for his command. When she noticed that, she made the claim and said, Boaz, you are the one in our family who's recognized as a kinsman redeemer. I want you to lay that claim upon me. It was a bold thing for Ruth to do, but she did it. And she had reason to do it because she could sense that there was a real relationship between her and Boaz. Now, there's one complicating problem that's dealt with into chapter 4, where Boaz is going to redeem Ruth. The complicating factor that's dealt with in chapter 4 is apparently in the hierarchy of the kinsman redeemers, there was somebody in line before Boaz in reference to the descendants of Elimelech. In other words, he didn't, boy, this is kind of a crude way to put it, but he didn't have the first draft pick. He had the second draft pick. And somebody else had to pass on Ruth and the land before Boaz could say, I'll take the package. And the way that they do it is really brilliant. Chapter 4 explains it. I mean, you read the text yourself, but it's really just a beautiful story. Boaz does it with such brilliant calculation. He comes up to this man who's nameless. There's no name. He's just the closer kinsman redeemer. He comes up to this man who, so to speak, he had the first draft pick in this whole thing. And he says, hey, I hear that Elimelech's land is up for grabs. Do you want to take it? And the guy gets the shekel signs going in his eyes. Yeah, the land, man, I want that land. That sounds great. Land's a big deal in Israel or anywhere. It's a big deal. He wants the land. And then Boaz says, well, great. You're the first one in line. You got the first draft pick, all that. But there's just one thing you need to know. If you're going to take the land, you also got to take Ruth. Now, look, I think it's very revealing in this because when the man heard that he had to take Ruth, he said, I can't do it. Now, let me just read to you here, Ruth chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption. For you yourself, I cannot redeem it. Basically, what the man said is, I'm already married, and I can't add another wife or I'll ruin my inheritance plans. And so I can't do it. I think Ruth was probably a beautiful woman, and he would have been pleased to add her as a wife, but he couldn't do it because it would ruin inheritance. That opened up the door for Boaz to marry Ruth, and that's what happens at the end of chapter 4. They get married, and they have children, and as we read, you have Boaz, his son Obed, Obed Jesse, and Jesse David. Ruth and Boaz are the great grandparents of King David over Israel. So this is just kind of the flow and the important events of the books. Let's move on. Where do we see Jesus in the book of Ruth? Well, first of all, we see Jesus as being a descendant of Ruth and Boaz. Look, isn't that pretty obvious? Jesus, being of the line of David, of the tribe of Judah, he is a descendant of Ruth and Boaz. So there, right there. Here's the other thing. This provides the connection that King David had with Bethlehem, and later on, the connection that Jesus had with Bethlehem. Why was Jesus born in Bethlehem? Well, Jesus was born in Bethlehem because the people from David's lineage had to go back to the city of Bethlehem under the decree of Augustus that the whole world should be taxed. And so all these things connection. Jesus would not have been born in Bethlehem except by the whole events in the book of Ruth. But then probably the most remarkable display we have in the book of Ruth is that we see that Jesus is presented in the book of Ruth as our kinsman redeemer. Again, I want you to remember that name that's on the screen right there, the Goel. And the Goel, that term, it's used 13 times in the book of Ruth, and it's a very important word, the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. Let's talk a little bit about that idea of the kinsman redeemer. First of all, the kinsman redeemer had to be related by blood. Let me go on to the next slide here and read these two passages from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5. We'll go back to that previous slide in just a moment. But look at these. It talks about the kinsman redeemer. Now, this is in reference to passing on the family inheritance. Okay, here we go. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. All right? This was a command in the Old Testament. Let's just take it in a hypothetical example. And look, we all know that real life can be very complicated. And sometimes real life situations were complicated in the application of this. But just in general, here's the hypothetical situation in mind. A man dies having married a woman but providing her with no children. Now the man dies, and his brother has the responsibility to, and I don't know how to say this exactly gracefully, he has the responsibility to impregnate his brother's widow so that she will have a son and the name of her brother will not perish in Israel. The son would not be counted as his own son, it would be counted as the son of his dead brother. Now, I don't want to be crude in this, but you might think, well, wow, the guy gets to be with another woman. Why wouldn't he want that? Well, I'll tell you why he wouldn't want that. Because basically he has to support a kid for 15 years after that. The whole point of it was to impregnate the woman. This wasn't a thing of just, a night of pleasure or something. And you had to raise that child as if he were your own, but he was not your own. And he received your brother's inheritance, not anything from you. And so sometimes there was a hesitancy to take on this role of the kinsman redeemer. We see just a few verses later in that same chapter, it says this. This is Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 7 through 10. But if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate of the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. But if he stands firm and says, I do not want to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal removed. Man, isn't that radical? In other words, there was the provision where the man could refuse to take this woman in and provide a descendant to her. He could do that, but if he did, he would be disgraced in Israel. And they even had a public ceremony with the sandal to indicate the disgracing. That ceremony is mentioned in Ruth chapter 4. That's what it says. Take a look here, verse 7 of Ruth chapter 4. Now this was the custom for in former times in Israel concerning anything in exchange and confirm anything. One man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation of Israel. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, buy it for yourself. So he took off his sandal. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahalon's and from the hand of Naomi. So anyway, this transaction includes this whole clause of the sandal here taking place. This was the responsibility of the kinsman redeemer. He was the man in the family who had the responsibility to buy back somebody from slavery, to redeem them, to get back land that had been lost to the family. The emphasis was always placed on keeping the land in the family, if at all possible. So let's go on to the next idea of the kinsman redeemer, though. And this has to do with the kinsman redeemer being a bad dude. You see, the kinsman redeemer, or the Goel in the Old Testament, he wasn't just like this romantic rescue figure. Okay, let me put it this way. If I could use just dumb things, out-of-date figures. Look, this is about 20 years out of date. But, you remember that guy who was like a minor icon in pop culture, Fabio, right? Big, long hair. There he is on the back of a horse. It's this wonderful romantic figure. I mean, it was sort of kitschy and all that, but you get the idea. Well, look, the kinsman redeemer wasn't just that kind of dude. He wasn't kind of, oh, I'm the romantic rescuer of the damsel in distress. You know what he was? The dude was like a gladiator. The dude was like a hitman as well. He was not a man to be trifled with. Numbers chapter 35, verses 12 and then 19 through 21 says this. They shall be cities of refuge for you from the avenger. You can see the slide that's up on the screen. That the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation in judgment. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death, and when he meets him, he shall put him to death. If he pushes him out of hatred, or while lying in wait, or hurls something at him so that he dies, or in enmity strikes him with his hand so that he dies, the one who struck him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. Now you see up on the screen how I have put in bold the word avenger there. That's because it's the same Hebrew word goel. It's the same guy. You see, you could look at it this way. The goel, the kinsman redeemer, which Boaz is in the story of Ruth, he was the guy in the family who would set things right. If somebody was murdered in the family and the authorities didn't handle it right, the avenger of blood was like a hitman. And he went out and he took care of business. If there was something in the family where somebody needed to be bought out of slavery, or land needed to be redeemed, or progeny provided to a widow, the avenger of blood was responsible to make sure it happened. He was the guy who set things right in the family. He is the goel. Now do you see how this kinsman redeemer, this goel, is such a beautiful and powerful illustration of Jesus himself? He's the guy who sets things right in the family of humanity. He's the one who buys us out of slavery. He's the one who is our avenger of blood. That's why we as believers, we say, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, not us. We leave vengeance up to our goel, Jesus, not unto our own sake. And he is that goel for our behalf. He's the one who sets things right in our family. It's really a very powerful and a really beautiful concept, and it points back to this idea of Jesus being everything he should for his people. All right, well, let's continue on. We just got a couple more things to consider. First of all, let's consider this idea. What if the book of Ruth was not in the Bible? Well, what would we miss if Ruth wasn't in the Bible? Well, first of all, we'd miss a great love story, wouldn't we? I mean, this is just great. This magnificent short story that's just so beautiful to consider. Ruth provides that for us. We'd miss something there. But not only that. First of all, we wouldn't have an adequate answer to the question, was everyone wicked and ungodly in the day of the judges? You know, if you read the book of Judges, you might think that they were. And certainly there were seasons, but there were times when there were godly people in the book of Judges. You see in the book of Ruth, Naomi was godly, even though she had to come back to faith. Ruth was godly. Boaz was godly. Most of the people of Bethlehem seemed to be godly. So again, it answers that question for us. Secondly, it answers the question, does God only love the Israelites? No, never. God had a great... God's choice of Israel was not racial in its core. It was faith-based. And a person from any race, from any nation, from any language, from any ethnicity, if they would come and receive the God of Israel, then God would receive them. A third thing that we see from the book of Ruth is it sort of answers the questions is, did the Messiah only come from Israelite ancestors? And the answer to that is definitely no. Not only do we have Rahab in the book of Joshua, but here we have Ruth the Moabitess from the book of Ruth. We have an answer to the question, what is the price of failing to trust? Of course, the great failure to trust that I see in the book of Ruth is on the behalf of Elimelech and his family, how they should have stayed there in Bethlehem, but it was in unbelief that they went to Moab. Now, God used it. God even used it to bring in a woman into the genealogical line of Jesus. But nevertheless, it was the price of their failing to trust. And then it's also cool because the book of Ruth gives us an idea of how the law of the kinsman redeemer actually worked. It seems that because Boaz was delighted to take the place, there's no mention of spitting in the face of the unnamed man who had the first draft pick and passed her by. Because there was no reason to disgrace him because someone was qualified and ready to take that position. By the way, this is another thing I need to mention about the kinsman redeemer that I didn't mention before, but I think is very important. The kinsman redeemer had to be qualified. It couldn't just be any Tom, Dick, or Harry who said, yeah, I want to be the superhero for the family. No, it was an established position of trust in the family, and everybody knew it. It wasn't just given out. Nobody could claim it unto themselves. It was recognized by the tribe and the family. All right, continuing on. What are some problem passages in the book of Ruth? Well, you got Ruth and the principle of levirate marriage. That phrase, levirate marriage, is that custom that I spoke to you of the surviving brother giving children to the widow of his deceased brother. That whole scheme is called levirate marriage. And friends, you know, there's some people kind of scandalized by that, but look, this is just how it was in the ancient world when there was a premium placed on the idea that a man's line and a man's property should not die out with him. That if at all possible, it should be passed on to progeny. This is one of the ways that God preserved that. So some people regard that as a problem. Frankly, I don't, so I'll just forget about that. Secondly, you have the whole idea of Ruth and the principle of redeeming property. Again, I don't regard this as a problem, but it's just interesting to note that the book of Ruth shows how important it was to keep this property. You would think that Elimelech had permanently forfeited his property when he went from Bethlehem to Moab and lived there for 10 years or so. You would think it was gone forever. No, that property was still in his name, and it could be redeemed for the sake of his descendants. And that's exactly what happened in that. So it's really not a problem, but it just shows kind of this interesting principle. And then you talk about Ruth and the principle of the Goel, the kinsman redeemer. Again, I don't really regard this as a problem, but again, I would just emphasize the fact that the Goel was a rough guy. Boaz was not just a pretty boy with a lot of money who could be nice to Ruth. He's also the guy who would cut off the head of somebody who committed a murder that was not avenged properly by the civil authorities. And that's a heavy thing to have that principle in the society. So again, very few problems, so to speak, issues, controversies surrounding the book of Ruth, but those are just a few of them. If you have any further ones, you can just speak to the instructor. Perhaps our friend David Cuff is present for this class. Maybe as we close this, you can end with a little Q&A session with Pastor David Cuff. Make sure that you go to Michael and get your work checked for both your attendance, your study sheet, and your chapter notes. Look, four chapters this week. You tell me you couldn't write a couple sentences on 4 chapters? It was the easiest thing you had all week. And then, of course, you're supposed to listen to Chuck's study track through there and fill out the study sheet with that. And then we'll carry on. And next week, we'll be getting into the book of 1 Samuel. Very, very exciting book. So let me pray, and then we'll conclude for the day. Father in heaven, we thank you for what many people have called the romance of redemption. And how the book of Ruth shows us that you could have accomplished our redemption in sort of a cold, technical way. But Lord, just because this is the kind of God you are, you filled it with love. You filled it with an element of mystery. You filled it with an element of attractiveness. And for all those reasons, Lord, we thank you and we receive it and we are very grateful. So we praise you together here, Lord, this evening, and I ask for your blessing upon this class. And thank you for those who have come this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.